Picture this. The year is 2014. Ubisoft are on a roll in wake of the release of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag the previous year. Watch Dogs came and went. The ambitious title may have released in a rocky downgraded state, but at least the game underneath was good, and on the horizon comes a new beginning for the company's flagship series, Assassin's Creed Unity. Unity was meant to be an absolute game changer for the Assassin's Creed series. Its marketing circa 2014 suggested as much, considering the sheer volume of information, trailers and demos we got, showcasing what felt like every single aspect of the game in detail so painstaking I wouldn't be surprised if there was a reported hike in sightings of Alex Amancio in cases of sleep paralysis. In hindsight, Unity's marketing was a textbook example of overhyping at its finest, and that isn't uncharacteristic for Ubisoft. But Unity's marketing campaign was more self-indulgent than usual. We got to see every little thing, how the parkour had been overhauled to be both a challenge of efficiency like the original system from 1 through Revelations, and an aesthetic marvel like 3 and Black Flag had tried to be at least. We saw how the combat had been made more challenging and a shift away from the counter-combo systems of the past, how the stealth had become more expansive, and most importantly, the game's selling point, co-op multiplayer. The reason why the game was called Unity after all is the fact you could play certain missions, or just roam around revolutionary Paris with 3 of your friends. Whether or not the average Assassin's Creed fan had that many friends aside, it was a delightful novelty to anticipate. Playing Assassin's Creed with your mates, coordinating to carry out complex objectives, working together rather than simply the PvP seen in Brotherhood Revelations 3 and 4, it sounded like a blast. But that could only ever be part of the game, and Unity certainly boasted a few sizable selling points. The promo material made it look utterly fantastic, the gameplay seemed entirely overhauled in every department, the customization options looked abundant, and then on top of all of that, we get online co-op. It was probably one of the most highly anticipated releases the series had ever seen. The only reason that was notable, of course, was because come release, it really didn't meet the expectation Ubisoft's over-the-top marketing had casually promised. Unity at launch, before we start looking at the issues that plague the actual game beyond it, of which there are many, was a horrific buggy mess. Pop-ins, glitches, characters' entire faces despawning, horrid performance across all platforms marred with crashes. It was disastrous, and Watch Dogs' own release date a few months prior certainly helped soften the blow, and built an anticipation of this being the case, but even then it was absolutely ridiculous. Of course, to this day you get people who claim that at launch they didn't experience any bugs, and I can only ask said people if their eyes actually function, or if they're only there for decoration. Because even now, over a decade later in the fixed state that people call it, the game is filled with technical issues. Unity's bugginess was monumental. It was a meme that stuck around for a bit. The game performed like arse, still doesn't perform exceedingly well today. It's nowhere near the broken slop show it was at launch, and I commend that, but it's also far from a polished experience. The game still performs in a way that can only be described as self-destructive. But you're not here to hear me moan about the launch issues, or performance issues of a decade-plus old game, heavily documented to have them, as much as it's quite a big talking point besides. So, the game underneath, well, some love it. I understand why they do. I didn't enjoy it so much in 2014. In fact, I thought it was a dreadful experience, to be honest, because, mate, you can't have Arno's dad's face despawn and expect me to care about him when he's killed. I also didn't enjoy the shallow skeletal love story wrapped up in a quintessential Ubisoft revenge plot done better dozens of times before, many instances of which are from the same damn company. Sidestep to allow development time for the co-op selling point the game doesn't commit to, and the gameplay wasn't anywhere near as fluid to feel as it was to look at, and that's talking about when it actually worked as intended. Unity was also the introduction of microtransactions. Ubisoft started that nonsense here. You can buy Helix points with real money and use them to bypass grinding for gear in an incredibly steep in-game economy that made getting late-game gear an irritation to say the least. The map was absolutely swamped in the overwhelming zoomed-out sight of a tsunami of icons indicating content for content's sake, much of which can be assorted into a series of collectibles and chests left in very illogical places for the player to find. and the rest can be filtered into very shallow cookie-cutter objectives, aside from maybe the murder mysteries that were perhaps more impressive as an idea than as a result. Then there's the massive input delay caused by the game performing like somebody hired a series of mob hits on the QA testers before they actually gave any feedback, resulting in a lockpicking system from hell, incredibly unresponsive combat, and parkour that routinely behaves in quite possibly every single way, aside from whatever your intended action might have been. Unity being a mess wasn't just about the bugs, but the game underneath's withstanding shortcomings. But I'm quite certain I'm not the only one who thinks that with 11 years of hindsight it's quite easy to view Unity positively. It may have been flawed in God knows how many ways, but it represented the future Assassin's Creed deserved, but never got. A future that clung more firmly to the ideas the series was built on. Unity was a game that sought to enhance that experience. It tried to modernise Assassin's Creed as Assassin's Creed, and in wake of it not necessarily being received terribly well, the series ultimately ended up moving in a different, safer direction that didn't necessarily result in dreadful games, but shed off too many of the layers of what made the series unique, reshuffling the priorities of the experience to the point where the series has become unrecognisable. Unity, if nothing else, was a blueprint for what Assassin's Creed could become, and now it's a skeleton of what the series will never be. Unlike its successors, Unity pushed the limits, and while in the game's case they were immovable objects, at least it dared to go there. It had ambition in a way the games since don't. It risked being bad at a chance of being great, and that in my opinion is the difference between most modern Ubisoft games and art. The fact that it failed to meet its own expectations might keep me from liking the game, but it certainly doesn't bar me from respecting it. I won't sit here and revise that Unity was somehow brilliant. That couldn't be further from the truth, but what it had was an idea behind it. I can see the vision, plain as day. I can also, unfortunately, see exactly what kept it from it. So, what went wrong with Assassin's Creed Unity? And why did it accomplish the exact opposite effect to its intent? Why wasn't this the series' future? Let's tuck in and find out. Assassin's Creed Unity brings us to Paris in the waning years of the 18th century, a time when France was in total disarray. The landscape of society itself was shifting monumentally. The French Revolution was a bloody time, characterised by massacres, public executions, and the aristocracy's complete loss of control over the common people. Some might argue a perfect setting for an Assassin's Creed game, a time of blood, terror, and immense change, and from a bird's eye view, on this point the game succeeds. Revolutionary Paris is a virtual one-to-one recreation of the heart of the city from the time. It may not be entirely accurate, but it's a filthy, crowded labyrinth of buildings and roads packed to the brim with madness. The crowds are the densest Assassin's Creed had ever seen, even if the NPCs seem to upscale and downscale rather abruptly, and right in front of you to the point where it seems they're actually morphing. Unity's Paris is gorgeous in a dark, gritty way fitting for the brutal chapter of French history on display, complete with a notable jump in graphics from Black Flag, and lighting systems that probably weren't worth sacrificing a day-night cycle for, but at least it looks tremendous. Paris is alive, boiling with a dense anger, and absolutely packed full of historical landmarks. The atmosphere is on point, the districts feel distinct. This recreation of a city is utterly breathtaking. It's detailed, compact, you could get lost in these streets, exploring every visual it has to offer. And it's oddly quite focused in wake of the Kenway saga that saw success experimenting with wilderness, with extra urban environments, whether they be the frontier in Assassin's Creed 3 or the Caribbean as seen in Assassin's Creed 4. Those experiences weren't without merit, but the urban setup is where Assassin's Creed comes into its own. You can't be a blade in the crowd if there is no crowd. The city is not just a backdrop for these games, it's an instrumental character. It's an environment that brings the historical setting on display to the forefront. People are abundant. The architecture around us embeds us in the history up until the point at which the game is set. It's a great enough concentration of static and moving parts to translate into an atmosphere, particularly one specific to this place and time. The atmosphere of the far less built-up environments of Assassin's Creed 4 by comparison is much more vague. You get a gist, you're sailing around in a godforsaken pirate ship. But there's a certain difference between capturing a fantasy and capturing a moment. And Assassin's Creed functioned best when the moment and the fantasy were separate things. The fantasy was you were an assassin. The moment was just your backdrop, your playground. Black Flag is where the game started to flirt with the idea of blending the two. The setting was the golden age of piracy. Thus, the game strived to give us a pirate fantasy. It's a good story wrapped up in an average game that services the original fantasy of the series out of obligation, salvaged by impeccable writing, granting it some excellence. And as a result, I love Assassin's Creed 4 and all its tailing missions, but its historical distinction is made through living the history. The narrative has to heavy-handedly focus on it, because if it didn't, and you were just playing as an assassin in this setting surrounded by the odd pirate, the setting would lack the precision to carry value. The priority of the urban setting allows the history to assume a more passive role. The history is all around you. The plot no longer needs to deviate massively to adequately explore it in the packaging of a gimmick. You're at the centre of the action, a built-up urban centre, dense with people, all affected in major and minor ways by the changes of the day. Meaning, in this setting, the story can just be about being an assassin, and seeing how the assassins apply to this chapter of history as opposed to how a chapter of history might factor before that. Now, this isn't to say Black Flag is somehow not a good entry to the series, when quite the opposite is true, but it worked for very particular reasons. It was built on the understanding it was an outlier, and provides the valuable philosophical angle of an outsider. So it's interesting to see that following the success of that game, a company notorious for doubling down on things that work until they somehow don't anymore, simply didn't do that. At least not immediately. But that doesn't mean the scales are balanced. Assassin's Creed Unity encountered an entirely different issue. Now, it's no historical education tool, so it can be forgiven for this, but as fascinating as the setting is, the story is so wayward that it's impossible to get an angle on it. Amidst the madness, we play as Arno Dorian, a young novice assassin whose father died when he was a boy. He was murdered for reasons entirely unrelated to the plot, after which point he found himself under the care of a Templar Grand Master whom is killed early in the game, with Arno being framed for the murder. In prison, he meets an old friend of his father, an assassin who tells Arno his old man was also a member of the Brotherhood. After some training, they break out of the Bastille, and Arno finds his life shattered. His love interest, Francois de la Serre's daughter Elise, is alienated, and this leads him to the Brotherhood, to find redemption for the murder that he failed to prevent, and uncover the truth behind Francois de la Serre's killers. So, this guy has just joined the Assassin Brotherhood to investigate the murder of a Templar. Well, I suppose he's in the right place. Jokes aside, it's actually an incredibly interesting narrative premise for why somebody would be led to the Brotherhood. And it's a damn shame the game is awful at exploring its own ideas. With Paris boiling over, there's plenty of room for assassins to do their thing, and with society around these warring factions crumbling in real time, it's actually rather thematically appropriate to have the lines between allies and enemies be blurred. It seems Francois de la Serre and Mirabeau, the Parisian Brotherhood's mentor, were negotiating some kind of truce, and that is ultimately what caused an uprising from within the Templars, so the infamous faction is split in two, a conservative strand and an extremist strand, the latter of which is led by some mystery man whose activities no doubt helped bring about the madness of the French Revolution. Then the assassins are also conflicted, with those who believe peace with the Templars might be possible, and those who firmly believe the Templars will always be the enemy. France isn't the only thing in turmoil. The very higher structures of these secret ancient enemies are undergoing monumental changes of their own. Unity's setting binds to a strong narrative opening, where we see how Arno slots into the turmoil, the son of an assassin, now the ward of a Templar Grand Master, haunted by the deaths of both, but mostly the latter. In fact, his father's death is completely irrelevant and could have been cut out completely and left for exposition to no loss of value. He's driven to the Brotherhood not out of a desire to kill Templars, but out of it being his only choice to find justice for Francois de la Serre, honour his father, though the plot very quickly forgets about him, and redeem himself for his failings to prevent the deaths of these fatherly figures he feels so responsible for. The setting was strong, fit for a revolutionary entry, one that promised to push the limits of technology, and the story's opening promised something interesting and complex, so how did they fumble it? You see, from this point, after everything's established, the narrative becomes very bare bones. Maybe 1 or 2 main story missions a sequence, up to a maximum of 3 if we're lucky, I suppose, and as a result there isn't enough narrative substance to adequately explore all the game establishes is important. For the runtime of the actual narrative contents, the story doesn't flesh itself out enough because it can't. Now, the narrative is primarily hindered by the fact that it's down the list of priorities. The game was trying to revolutionize the gameplay aspect, it was trying to push co-op, trying to integrate that into the experience in a way that was meaningful. So I don't think it would necessarily have saved the narrative were it efficient, but the narrative was inefficient. It dedicated a lot of its time to things that didn't matter. We got a random fan service opening set centuries before the story. Its idea was to present us with the concept of there being a Sword of Eden, so it isn't entirely functionally redundant, but its primary purpose was to showcase Altair robes but dark, and therefore casually remind us of where the series began. Then there's Arno's father's death that is entirely redundant. At the start of the game, he's murdered at the palace in Versailles, resulting in the protagonist becoming an orphan, and while his Brotherhood initiation hallucination suggests that Arno is feeling some guilt with regards to his father's death, this is not a parcel of the story that's explored remotely. In fact, we do know what happened to Charles Dorian. He was murdered by Shay Cormac at the end of Assassin's Creed Rogue, and that narrative is entirely disconnected from this one, and that makes it unsatisfying to set up because it goes nowhere. And Unity would not have suffered for not having this be the opening to the game, even with Arno's father canonically dying this way. We don't need to see it because it has no bearing on Arno's long-term story. Any impact it might have had on the story is overshadowed by Francois de la Serre's murder. In other words, this is not the opening of the narrative to Assassin's Creed Unity. This is just the ending to Assassin's Creed Rogue from Arno's perspective. And if anything, it would have been strengthening to Rogue to not have us see this twice, particularly considering the storylines don't otherwise connect. Then there's the game's modern day segment. Now, I'm a huge advocate for Assassin's Creed having a modern day. I think the storylines don't function as well without it, but here it actually contributed nothing. In fact, it made the entire narrative pointless. You see, Unity sits in that sandwich of Assassin's Creed games where the modern day had absolutely no direction. Following 3's ending, the series had no overarching protagonist and no clear path forward with the modern day, and so Black Flag's modern day segments were very much so a festival of Easter eggs. And while it didn't shy away from introducing us to any interesting new concepts, it felt like a false start, but at least it had an interactive element. Unity's modern day amounts to video calls with a woman codenamed Bishop, and the premise is the modern day protagonist is ourselves, sat at home playing a game that has been hijacked by the assassins to send us mining through memories for data pertaining to a sage, in hopes that we can acquire the sage's body before Abstergo do. This is precisely why we're scouring through Arno's memories to begin with. It's framed as a race against time to prevent the modern-day Templars from acquiring this very powerful corpse. But in the end, Arno stashes his tattered bones in Paris's catacombs. Now, just one skull in a sea of many, and as the credits roll, we're told how pointless it will be to go and look for those as the Templars aren't finding them. In other words, the narrative is rendered pointless. The story doesn't contribute to the progression of the series beyond it. From the modern day perspective in particular, it was all for nothing. We canonically wasted our time, so why waste precious time on it? Unity's one of few Assassin's Creed games that would actually be better for not having a modern day, because that way more time could be dedicated to things that at the very least pretend to be interesting. The things that have to be more skeletal than ideal to account for all this fluff. For instance, unravelling the Templar conspiracy. Typically this is done through the confession rooms. After you've assassinated a target, you're transported to this place where it's just you and your victim, and you're having a conversation about the Templar conspiracy. Well, that's not how it works in Unity. In Unity, you make the kill and you get to observe your target's memories, and this allows you to piece together what the Templars are up to. And while it allows it to be comprehensible, It's a shortcut that kind of dispels the sense of mystery. It doesn't leave room for anywhere near as much interpretation as an interaction between an assassin and a Templar, and it also makes no sense. How is Arno seeing his target's memories? Sure, the memory corridors all the way back from Assassin's Creed 1 were something of a break in logic themselves, but at least you could rationalise them, that these were just how Altair remembered these interactions. How he was so immersed in the conversation that he only remembered the important details, with the target appearing lifelike despite being bleeding out on the floor because of just how potent the words were, how their convictions made him question his own. And because of how engrossed in that interaction the character was, the Animus filters out all the unnecessary information. With Unity's approach, how can you see somebody else's memories? Is Arno's hidden blade a little plug-in Animus or something, centuries before those were invented? No, of course it wasn't. There's just no room for interpretation here. It's a plaster for a narrative that's moving too quickly to explore itself. And I think the target stories would have benefited from being more fleshed out, so we could experience more of it chronologically. But no, the game needed to open with a prologue to the prologue to the prologue, and give us meaningless modern day segments for the sake of having it. They had to dedicate chunks of time to jumping through rifts and being transported to different eras of history to avoid Abstergo looking for us. And while that absolutely resulted in cool set pieces, the complex edition that they were, they diluted the stories more simple moment to moment. Also, we could climb the Eiffel Tower despite the game being set a century before it was even built. And I get it, it's a cool inclusion, so it's probably weird to critique it. So I'll say those interruptions would be welcomed if the basics of the storytelling were on point. But they're just not, so it's a direct hampering. Take for instance Arno's character work. He's a likeable guy, but he isn't charismatic. Nor does he actually develop. We see him as a directionless nobleman living in Versailles, a troublemaker. He's snarky, dismissive and sarcastic. Once his life is imploded and he finds himself imprisoned, he remains snarky, dismissive and sarcastic. And he remains snarky, dismissive and sarcastic after having joined the Brotherhood. He has dialogue quips throughout the story that are supposed to come off as cool and defining, but because it's all defined by his start point, it comes across as static. Throughout the story, he's a young man who takes issue with authority. His demeanour doesn't necessarily adjust as he becomes more of an assassin. If anything, his actions become more brazen and more impetuous. The events of the story give him a mission, they give him some direction, but they don't necessarily inspire his character to change, to go on a personal journey. And the game recognises this and slaps a speech at the end of the story that would have been good if it felt earned, but unfortunately it doesn't. Not enough of the plot is dedicated to Arno's mentality. So you can regurgitate Ezio and make him French as much as you want, but that does not equate an interesting character. A character who's initially likeable, maybe, but a character that ultimately doesn't go anywhere. And that's really frustrating because the end speech suggests his character did change over the course of the story. The game just allocated no time to us actually seeing it as it happened, and Arno's not the only character who suffers for this. Elise is the obvious casualty, Arno's love interest, Francois de Lasserre's daughter, and she's on a mission for vengeance against those who killed her father. She's a Templar, an ancient enemy, yet also a huge focus of Arno's affection, his biggest weakness both as a man and an assassin. That's a very interesting idea to explore. So yes, it's disappointing the game barely scratches the surface. Arno aids Elise in her quest for vengeance, but as for their relationship prior to events being set in motion, we get two very brief exchanges, outlining that they've known each other since childhood, and highlighting that relationship has matured into romance. And then the next we see of them, they're momentarily alienated, and then they're brought back together to work together. And we know they're both driven to achieving the end point, but what we don't see is how these characters actually bond. While I wouldn't have necessarily opted for one, the love story isn't bad because it's present, it just isn't fleshed out to the point where we can actually see what these characters mean to each other. Particularly since this dynamic correlates directly with Arno's personal investment. It's underdeveloped in that sense, meaning if you're going to sidestep the assassin element to Arno's story for the love element to Arno's story, commit. We need to see how these characters work together and we need to see how they differ. After all, one's an assassin, the other's a Templar. How has that dynamic thrown into their relationship altered their worldviews? And how can they find common ground from opposing sides in a war much bigger than them? These are things that Unity should have explored but struggles to. Why? It simply doesn't have the time, or more accurately doesn't dedicate the time. Another character the game underexplores is Pierre Belec, Arno's mentor. It's he who brings Arno into the fold to begin with, trains him to be an assassin. After that training aspect is done with, he takes a back seat. Mr. Pisspot becomes narratively irrelevant until he kills Mirabeau for even entertaining the idea that Elise might not be the enemy, and we're forced to fight and kill him in what should have been a highly emotional moment, but it's just not because it virtually came out of nowhere. Belek is portrayed as a crazed extremist, and because his presence falls off a cliff, the climactic showdown doesn't have the emotional impact it deserved. The game doesn't allocate time to explaining why Belek might have felt forced to kill Mirabeau, and that robs Belek of depth for one. The guy's portrayed as a rough and ready middle-aged master assassin. If you don't give that caliber of character depth, they just come across as unintelligent. And that's a problem when this is the guy we're supposed to believe trained Arno to become an assassin. How did he do that when he can't look past his own fucking nose? So I think failing to explore Belek and what motivates him, why he joined the Brotherhood, how he views the Brotherhood, all those things that could bring sense to the moment he killed Mirabeau before we even got there, is a massive disservice to a character who could have been much more interesting. Particularly when the showdown with him is actually one of the highlights of the story. If this confrontation had more meat to it than just Arno arguing with a fanatic on a rooftop before embracing that they'll have to fight, this cinematic showdown would have elevated the storytelling. Sure, the dangers of becoming extreme is a theme of the story, if Arno's speech at the end is to be believed anyway. But for the character who brought us into the fold, if they're going to become extreme, as Belek certainly has, it would be nice to actually understand why, not through his words, as we get that, but through a much slower burn. His character's grisly exterior makes his confrontational personality not necessarily enough to see a shift within him. We need to see how Arno and Belek diverge, and how that ultimately results in Belek becoming far more radical. But again, the game did not adequately allocate time for it. His betrayal spawns from nowhere. He'd faded to a background character. That should never have been allowed to happen. And the final example I'm going to use for this lack of character work, or underdeveloped character work at least, is the game's antagonist, Germain, the sage we've been looking for. We only meet him a few times directly, but we see a lot of him obscured in the memories of our targets, like it's not obviously him. He's a slippery villain without any modicum of menace. He managed to beguile Arno earlier in the story, trick him into thinking he was harmless, and that's cool. But I'm going to be honest with you, coming out of the story, I couldn't tell you what his motivations actually were. I get that he wants to strip the aristocracy of its power and give it to the middle class so he can create a capitalist society that the Templars can control. And he's a sage, so he ties into the Juno plot that the previous games were built upon, and was more or less entirely abandoned by this point to be finished in a comic. And I get he was a bit too extreme for Francois de la Serre, hence he was killed. But the guy doesn't have the presence or the screen time to actually make us think about what if he wins. The guy just kind of exists. He's a weak villain to counter a weak protagonist in a cast of weak characters. And the most frustrating part is that isn't born out of no potential. It's all born out of the fact that the storytelling is bare bones, like a loosely strung together series of concepts that the game's development ran out of time to sensibly explore. The characters aren't the only thing the game struggles to accommodate though. It's also incredibly difficult to make sense of the French Revolution. Now, I think it's beneficial to Unity to not treat this game like a history learning exercise. We don't need to learn the history, or even know the history, to enjoy the gaming experience set before us. However, I think I came out of this game knowing less about the French Revolution than when I'd gone in. I really like that it doesn't feel a need to slot us into every major event throughout the entire French Revolution, like Assassin's Creed 3 did with the American Revolution, but I can't be the only one feeling as if the storytelling didn't bring sense to the background events. I couldn't tell you who's fighting for what. People just appear to be fighting throughout the streets of Paris. There are extremists adorned with red causing trouble in the streets. What are they doing? What are their motivations? Why are they there? Who are they fighting against? Anyone? Must be. Who are the assassins siding with? Who are the Templars siding with? It may not be that straightforward. Why is it not that straightforward? At no point in Unity could I actually understand who was after what. Arno himself takes no interest in the revolution, so it's impossible to grasp what other characters' stake might be. Never mind how their actions might impact the cause and effect of the history books. And it's not that we don't meet plenty of historical figures, we most certainly do. But we don't spend enough time with any of them to even begin to understand them through the game. So as a result, any background events that they may or may not be involved with become mush. because the game doesn't have the time to make it otherwise. Now, overall, I'm not saying Unity's story is the worst thing you'll ever consume, far from it, but it most certainly is not the strongest of narratives either. But why is that? Well, it has nothing to do with the story, of course. Unity's ambition was more than anything to elevate the gameplay and integrate co-op. So let's talk gameplay. In the gameplay department, Unity's intent was to be absolutely revolutionary. It updated every aspect of the gameplay in an attempt to give the series a next-generation feeling back in 2014. The combat had been changed to be something actually challenging, the parkour had been changed to be more aesthetically pleasant, while granting the player more options and function than the Kenway saga, and the stealth now had a crouch button, I suppose. The thing is, that didn't necessarily result in a better playing game. I'll say this, Unity plays incredibly janky. Across all systems, it feels like an incredible battle just to get the game to behave. What does that mean? Well, it feels at times like the gameplay is actually conspiring against you. The parkour is a great aspect to start here, the most obviously changed thing. Now it's accented with twirls and spins. It looks incredible, and with buildings that we can enter dominating the landscape. The system had to be more advanced than anything the series had seen before. But trying to establish a rhythm, trying to get a flow going, trying to do things quickly as the game suggests you should try to do, the actual free running system seems to get confused. So you have two functions, you've got free run up and free run down, which allows you both to scale and safely descend from buildings. When the game's in a charitable mood and the system decides to work, this is like a knife through butter. But when you're trying to do specific things as advertised, such as enter buildings through windows, without breaking the free flow of it, the game makes an absolute 3-course meal of getting you through that bloody window with Arno dashing around it and doing anything but going in as you scramble to figure out whether parkour up or parkour down will get you through it. There are other times where Arno will, without reason, refuse to do what actions you've input, oftentimes opting to do something else entirely. Sure, there are moments where things click and it works, but when you're trying to carry out complex functions due to just how much is mapped to one command, the game has a tendency to assume incorrectly as to what you're trying to do, and that gets between you and achieving what you're after. There are few doubts that it's an incredibly pretty system, particularly when you take straightforward pathways you know won't break the experience, but that's such a minuscule percentage of the overall pathways you could theoretically take. So janky and disjointed freerunning becomes the staple of the average playthrough. Would I take this over the parkour system from Origins onwards? In a heartbeat. But just because this system gave a toss about itself does not make it particularly satisfying. It's also incredibly sticky for reasons I can't quite fathom. Arno will just stick to things and refuse to move for a second. For instance here, he's stuck to the sky? This makes the overall movement incredibly sluggish. Arno doesn't feel fast, he doesn't feel agile to play as, he feels lethargic. And this lethargy translates to the combat as well. I get Unity's premise, it's meant to be a more stealthy game than we're used to with Assassin's Creed prior to this point. So you can rationalise the combat's shortcomings away as just a soft fail state. It doesn't change the fact that Unity is not actually a stealth game, since you're forced into open combat scenarios all the time. The problem I have with this combat is it's heavily pitted against the player. It's still relatively easy, but if you stand still you will be killed pretty quickly. You can't make as many mistakes as in previous games, and that's good. It means it's an actual gameplay system and it isn't just there to be cinematic, and that works out because it's actually quite ugly. I should be praising this, but the combat system doesn't function very smoothly. So unlike in the previous games where you might be attacked one at a time or two at a time in the Kenway saga, leading to cinematic kills, they're not necessarily challenging, but they are fun in their own way for a bit. Here, if you get swamped, you get swamped. And that's fine, don't get in combat. Well, like I said, the game puts you in combat all the time. From here, it's quite simple. Parry, dodge, attack. But there are certain things that make the combat a pain. Guys with guns, for instance. For some reason, it's very 50-50 as to whether or not you can dodge these. Stun bombs, again, it's very, very hard to not get flashbanged 20 times in a fight. These make the combat experience more agonizing to watch, without necessarily increasing the difficulty of the fight itself. Because at its core, it's very simple. If you're not overwhelmed, you'll be fine, but if you're overwhelmed, things start to get a bit loopy. The combat system is punctuated by janky animations, unavoidable attacks, and animations initiated by you that inexplicably bail on themselves. And while I appreciate it penalises you for having a one-man army approach that you might have got away with Connor, the game still puts you in countless situations where you're forced to take that approach anyway. On top of that, there's a lack of animation variety to keep the fight visually interesting, particularly if you're facing several enemies. Sometimes you'll find yourself being helped by random citizens who only manage to get in the way. The camera sometimes has a seizure if you have a fight indoors, as the game often tends to push you towards. And if we're not plagued with all of that, we encounter Unity's biggest problem: monstrous input delay. This might just be because I decided to play this on the PlayStation 5 because I didn't want my PC to explode, and that is effectively just the PS4 version. But in various aspects of the gameplay, I noticed the game is incredibly slow to respond to input. Though this isn't combat related, the lockpicking is a great example of this, so I'm going to slot this in here. The lockpicking is very simple: press a button according to a prompt. You've got to press the button when the pin enters this optimal area. If you miss, you break a lockpick. If you succeed, you can move on to the next pin. So naturally you'd think that means pressing the button when it's here, but no, you actually have to press it before, by quite some way, so the game can register it in time. On PC, it's not really an issue, granted, but it's still not ideal for the console version. Apply this leisurely response time to the combat and the results can be equally frustrating. And when the game's performance is hardly consistent, it can be incredibly challenging to predict the moment-to-moment changes in that response time. So with the combat being messy on top, you find yourself having to react to things you can't predict, and that results in a lot of deaths that you don't necessarily feel are your fault. Oddly, if anything, it helps make perfect parries incredibly easy though. Now, I don't want to bash the combat without addressing that I actually quite like the idea of having the combat in Assassin's Creed be challenging, but I think it's also fair to say that Unity's combat isn't actually that challenging. It's technologically lumpy, as is the rest of the game, and that results in one mistake becoming 5, but when the game is behaving, the combat is incredibly straightforward, and it can be reliably cheesed with an excess spam of smoke bombs that will earn you a few free hits a go. So when you're overwhelmed but don't want to leave combat or can't leave combat, just smack down a few smoke bombs, and use that to get as much out of it as possible. I'm glad, based on how the combat is otherwise strung, that this works so well, but considering how many of these things you can prospectively carry later on in the game with the right gear, it is a bit overpowered because it flattens the difficulty. But again, the input being as unresponsive as it is, you might end up pressing the button twice and dropping 2 smoke bombs for no reason. So to coast through a true mass of enemies, your best bet is to rely on one tactic over and over and over, and the only thing that's there to guide you away from a complacent playstyle is the fact the game runs like it's going to get a medal for taking part. Now, to move on and talk stealth, I quite like Unity's stealth to a point. If you have the patience for it, it is functional. Although with the game trying to be grander, it can be tough on getting a bearing on where all of your enemies are. You might be surrounded by the guys. Obviously, with massive crowds, blending is fairly simple. Just walk through the crowds, and try to ignore all the aggressive pop-ins. Beyond the much denser crowds to get lost in, the only things it really does that are all that different are crouching and clinging to cover. Sticking to cover can be a bit stickier than it should be, with cancelling being in cover sometimes posing a bit of a challenge, and crouching just makes your movement quieter. I don't know if this crouch button was worth the 6 million lines of code they had to alter to get it to work, but yeah, there are moments where it is quite handy. I don't have a lot of bad to say about the stealth, but I will say enemy detection times can be a tad inconsistent, therefore it's very tricky to see where the limits are and how bold you can be. What works in one scenario might not work in the exact same scenario, but again, for instance, and I typically find that pertains to when carrying out assassinations, whether or not you'll be able to dart across and do a follow-up assassination on another enemy who might have seen the first one before you enter combat. I just find reaction times can differ quite wildly here. But beyond that, the only other thing I want to talk about are the skills. This game has leveling features, which was mostly new for Assassin's Creed. We had it on the small scale with the ship in Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, but here, our gear, our skills, they directly dictate how capable Arno is, how powerful he is. This means we can change out Arno's weapons, we can customize his robes, and certain pieces of gear are better than others. Some bits of gear might be more stealth oriented, some might be more combat oriented, and if there's one thing I can say I'm not terribly fond of, is the game's tendency to make the good gear look like shit. Fortunately, with the right skills, for the most part this just becomes customization after a point and has very little bearing on how hard you'll find the game. But there are certain things that it makes no sense to be a skill we have to unlock. For instance, Sitting on benches. Arno has to unlock a skill to learn to sit on a bench. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't actually remember learning to sit down. If anything, it came kinda naturally. What a waste of a skill point. Surely blending like this is something Arno learned to do when he joined the Brotherhood, and the same I suppose would go for lockpicking and double assassinations. Why do we have to learn those again? So instead of unlocking skills that are worthwhile, particularly in stealth, you're actually mostly unlocking pivotal gameplay features to allow the system to work properly. Otherwise, I really enjoy Unity's stealth, or at least the occasions in which it feels reliable. Sometimes not keeping on top of your consumable tools can make it more challenging than it needs to be, but that wouldn't be an issue. In fact, it's good to prepare, were it not for this game's economy making consumables extortionately priced towards the back end of the game. So you'll just have to hope you loot a corpse that just happens to have phantom blade ammunition, just to save getting fleeced for the things by merchants. To move off of stealth and talk about customization as its own thing, the economy gets incredibly steep towards the good gear, and the only reason I can fathom why that might be the case was because the game needed to push microtransactions so you could hack your way past ludicrous prices with Helix credits. You know, so you don't have to grind as much of the game to get the best gear, so you can bypass playing it for hours longer. Now, the microtransactions got exponentially worse with Origins onwards, so I'm not going to equate it to that, but even here, the microtransaction system is designed to save you time playing the game. In other words, Ubisoft use it to, whether intentionally or otherwise, call their own game shit. They're preempting people being willing to pay money to bypass it. So from that perspective, the microtransaction model present in any Assassin's Creed game has always baffled me. They shamelessly know they're wasting your time. It's a business model. I don't even understand why this game has leveling at all. I mean, I suppose I do, it's for the co-op more than anything, but it doesn't really help the main game in this format. I mean, all it means is early on in the game, Arno can fight thugs in one part of Paris, but go to another part of Paris, and those identical thugs will mop the floor with him. I think more than anything, its intent is to cover up how short Unity's main story is, by forcing us to engage in enough other content to pad it out. But it does give a sense of progression to build up that star rating in the top left corner, even if it only does go up to 5. As for the rank, that's also there for online purposes, and is complete and utter nonsense. What even is an elite trainee? To me, an advanced apprentice is just an apprentice you have to actually pay, instead of just throwing peanuts at. Why is the game cluttering up the screen with meaningless words? I mean, it's not like there isn't another means through which the game communicates your power level, but at least that star rating is simple to follow and doesn't imply abstract concepts in the workplace. Jokes aside, that won't save Unity's UI. It's very dull to look at. It's clean, but the GTA 5 inspired square minimap annoys me. I don't understand why my username has to be on the screen at all times, and a couple of UI prompts routinely crop up in the same part of the screen overlaying each other quite often, so it undermines its own cleanly art style. Okay, I've gone a bit wayward. Let's talk blackbox missions. Now, these missions are your assassinations, and they were advertised as being revolutionary when the game wasn't out yet. The idea behind them is rather than following a predetermined path throughout the mission, all that matters is the end result. It's your job to sniff out opportunities, find unique kill opportunities, and if you don't use them, that is entirely up to you. You have the ultimate say to execute the mission how you see fit, and this was a big selling point for how the game revolutionizes the idea of assassination in gameplay. And it's a cool idea, right? You've got your task to infiltrate a location and take out your target, and there's no big brother on your shoulder telling you precisely how to do it every step of the way. The whole point being it's meant to have some replay value where you might play the mission again a different way. The issue is this game's black box missions are nowhere near deep enough for that. There may be one or two opportunities to capitalize on, maybe even a unique kill here and there, but ignore those select few things and you end up with a rather bland run in and kill your target and run away experience. The missions are a great idea if you look to say Hitman for comparison. Those games are a total masterstroke in cause and effect. Every action you take, every decision you make, every lead you follow up on, and every piece of information you learn is wrapped up into a purposeful series of events that can make multiple runs of the exact same level feel entirely different, with only the initiation and the result being the same. That is a black box. Unity's black box missions are just go in and kill objectives where you can ignore the series of events that might lead you to your target and carve your own way. In other words, they're just optional objectives that you can ignore. And the game doesn't really try to substitute the way it wants you to do things with something interesting if you choose not to follow up on that. So the creativity isn't rewarded beyond the basics of the gameplay, and the replay value doesn't necessarily fit the bill of black box. They certainly worked the idea a bit more for Syndicate to make these assassination missions feel worthwhile, but it's the same problem, there isn't necessarily enough variation for it to feel replayable. But I suppose that works out in Unity's favour. After all, you only get one save in this game, and you can't delete it. You have to go into the system to do that. So if you want to replay the story, you have to delete all of your progress. Why? The co-op gets in the way again. Now, it doesn't take a genius to see the black box missions had potential, and they weren't terrible missions as is either. But they crumble under the weight of any actual player experimentation, because outside of maybe one or two meticulously placed opportunities, there's actually nothing to find. And the opportunities the game does have sometimes just self-destruct. It was a great idea they fleshed out brilliantly for marketing purposes, but no further, unfortunately. So I shan't pretend they transcended how assassination missions went before Unity, because they weren't anything truly groundbreaking. Oh, hey look, a game crash. I didn't see that one coming. Now, I know I've fixated quite heavily on the bad when talking about the gameplay here, and that's because there's so much potential here, just like with the story, for something truly great to have come from it. But just like the story has the ideas but not the execution, the gameplay is almost exactly the same. The parkour attempted to elevate the layering of Paris to unprecedented levels, but with so many functions mapped to so few controls, it got lost in its own ambition and became a bit hard to operate. The combat tried to actually pose a challenge at the expense of becoming a clusterfuck. The stealth had a crouch button now, but otherwise didn't actually know how to push itself forward. As a result, the bulk of skills we could unlock for it amounted to relearning the basics from previous titles. The customization was an opportunity for the player to express themselves through Arno's robes, but it's hindered through every piece of gear being rated and rendered unbelievably expensive in the in-game economy to monetize a game they've already sold you. Then the black box missions were an interesting idea, a concept that could theoretically inject bucket loads of player creativity into the assassinations, but they very rapidly become plain and homogenized to the general gameplay loop the moment you start having any ideas of your own. They were a well of potential that remained untapped, although admittedly they did expand upon the idea a bit in Syndicate. Unity's gameplay ultimately was neither bad nor great, it was just a sea of fascinating ideas in a very temperamental wrapper. But it was hardly ready for the scrap heap. It was more than anything a concept, an idea, something that could have been taken and refined and was in particular areas in Syndicate, but was otherwise left behind rather tragically. And it's like I said earlier, it risked being this at the chance at being more. I don't think that should have been allowed to become a wasted effort. After all, failure is the greatest teacher, right? But that's enough gameplay rambles. Let's talk about the other area where Assassin's Creed Unity is a mess. Side content. Assassin's Creed Unity is the final boss of Ubisoft Open Worlds. Look at the state of this. I couldn't even list all the side content that you can find in this game without the video becoming 3 hours long. And you know how much of it is actually worth doing? Next to none of it. If that sounds like an exaggeration, it is. Most of this stuff is just a series of chests, and you'd open those naturally as you pass them. After all, why wouldn't you? It takes no time at all, and you might get money out of it which you can invest in better gear, or indeed, one medicine after about 10 of them. There are 4 kinds of chests: locked chests, not locked chests, chests that have gold icons for some reason, and nomad chests that have blue icons, because when Assassin's Creed Unity launched there was a companion app. Now that's shut down. All the content that was on there has actually migrated physically into the game. Once you get past that, you have collectibles like cocards, random coats of arms that you can just pluck off of walls. There are points of interest to go and see. It's a collectathon, there's lots to collect. Past that though, there's still a sea of side missions, all of which are reasonably straightforward. The companion missions, like I said, migrated from an app. They're fairly easy, and they pay out quite large, so doing them barely requires you to go out of your way. Paris stories, the quality of the overall mission is a bit of a hindrance. They become quite unengaging after a bit, if not right away. these Enigma things so we can unlock a darker coloured version of Altair's robes. Your mum. We can renovate various gaffs throughout the city to increase passive income, as seen in Brotherhood and Revelations, but far more marginal in benefit. Then there's the co-op missions and heists that I'll allocate a separate chapter, if you will, to in a minute. Assassin's Creed Unity presents an overwhelming barrage of side content, and a lot of it is mediocre, barely functional missions, with incredibly simple objectives because anything more complex might risk breaking the game. But there's one thing I really quite liked, though it's a nonsense factory of its own, and that is the murder mysteries. I do not know why Arnaud's investigating so many murders around Paris. He's probably contributed to just as many, but we've got to investigate suspicious deaths, question witnesses and suspects, gather the evidence, evaluate the evidence, and accuse who we think did it. If we accuse the wrong suspect, we lose a bonus on the reward, so the pressure's on us to get it right first time.
The horror, the gall of these vermin. Look at what they've accused me. But I'm in charge of the prison you'd like to throw me in.
Now what's funny is our accusation is enough to lock the correct perpetrator up, but if we accuse the wrong suspect, they'll just go nuh-uh and we'll have to continue with the investigation. So realistically, you can't get it wrong, you can only lose profit. And I otherwise have a very hard time believing that Arnaud would take time out of his very busy schedule of killing people to investigate the killing of people. There's an irony in that the game missed a golden opportunity to tap into. But I mean, the premise is certainly more interesting than most of the side content Unity otherwise has to offer. Because unlike most of the rest of it, it actually has us apply our brains, and does it in such a way that we'll do that before we Google the correct answer anyway. But this is where you might notice the UI placement get the most messy. But despite being very unrefined, it's the most unique content this game has, and it's good these investigations found their way into Syndicate somehow a year later, even if only as DLC. Not that I was as fond of the dumbed down investigations of the later titles. What I appreciate about these murder mysteries the most though is their miniature stories, and in morbid fashion fitting of the time period they bring Paris to life. But it isn't purposeful to the point where you'd understand why Arnaud would bother. But Ubisoft does have a long track record for purposeless side content for the sake of having side content, because Assassin's Creed 1 was criticised for not having side stuff to do. Nonetheless, I can think of worse ways to spend my time playing Assassin's Creed. Away from the murder mysteries, we have crowd events. Radiant, dynamic, simple objectives that crop up in passing, typically pertaining to killing some thugs, maybe scaring off some bullies, maybe tackling a thief, or killing a messenger without being seen that is totally impossible and cannot be done, no matter which method you deploy. Seriously, has anyone ever actually succeeded on the kill the messenger without being seen objective in this game? If so, let me know in the comments what you did. Do enough of these crowd events, you'll just get an in-game cash reward, and are tasked to do more of them in increments of 5. They crop up all the time, so they're hard to miss, and they just help you make some dosh on the side without wasting too much of your time. So, if anything, they kind of work. In a very simple way, they add an explosive factor to the crowds that an event could pop off at any time, but it is the same series of 5 or 6 events on repeat over and over again, so it does get a bit dull after a minute. Overall, very typical Ubisoft game side content. The fact that I've managed to summarise all I wanted to say on it in only 5 minutes or so should tell you that. I get the idea to make Paris as layered as possible, to make it interactive in as many ways as you can fit in the game, but the open world struggles to give the bulk of this content purpose. Obviously there's a ton of chests, and that is what it is. But filtering those out and the pointless collectibles that were a staple of the Assassin's Creed series up until 2015, the more juicy side content is also overall very unjuicy. And we're forced to, at the very least, experience some of it, if not a decent chunk, because the game now has a progression system. I get why Paris is so full of stuff. Unity intended for the game to be jam-packed with stuff worth your time to make this city feel alive, and that's very much so another thing that partially got lost in the game's own ambition, but also Ubisoft's complete lack of a solitary clue as to what makes compelling side content. So once you get to the back end of the story, most of the map is still full of stuff that you haven't done yet, and likely will never do. If you're a completionist who played this game around 2014, I really want to know how many therapists it took. Now, let's finally get around to the creme de la creme, shall we? The co-op. Now obviously I didn't manage to get anybody to play Assassin's Creed Unity co-op with me in 2025 because any friend I have who has played Assassin's Creed Unity in the past that I know reliably has a copy laying around somewhere, if I asked them, they would almost certainly ask what's wrong with me. But I think it's fair to say that Unity doesn't commit awfully well to its co-op model. I mean, it sacrifices a lot to implement it, that much is for certain. After all, this is what the story is skeletal to accommodate, and a lot of events of the French Revolution occur through these missions for us to enjoy with our mates. Now, the first thing the co-op missions struggle to do is integrate in a way that feels meaningful. Why is Arno engaged in these co-op missions? Who are the other assassins he's cooperating with? Is it entirely a mini-game for the player's entertainment and therefore the modern-day protagonist we're supposedly supposed to be? That would make the most sense as Bishop's the one who gives us the exposition before we dive in. So, in a race against time to find a sage's corpse, Bishop's just happy to let us doss around? Okay. Anyway, the co-op missions showcase some more fascinating, perhaps even more challenging missions that the main game doesn't, and it makes sense as to why they would be this way as you're supposed to be playing them with up to 3 of your friends, and fortunately, the game lets you play them solo. You still might get booted out due to a loss of connection with yourself, but I get the premise. They're meant to be a challenge for you to collaborate with friends on. That means playing co-op with random strangers is almost certainly going to end in chaos. But if you're on a call with some mates and you're all playing it, from my distant memories, it's actually not too bad. But you know what? They can be appreciated solo too. In fact, they'll have to be. Almost half of this game's skill points are locked behind co-op missions. Away from the actual missions themselves, there are also heists that are basically co-op missions but packaged differently, with more of a priority on monetary gain so you can upgrade your gear quicker. And you can also open world free roam with your mates. Where co-op loses its value is the fact the entire story can't be played in co-op, and while I understand why, that's kind of the purpose of co-op. The game sidestepped its own story among many other things for this co-op mode to be present, and it's not universally present. It too is a bit of a sideshow in a game that's built around it, and while to some people it will be never-endingly cool, you can't help but wonder what the point is. Its limited scope renders it unable to push past being a gimmick, and while I've seen worse gimmicks in this franchise, never mind anywhere else, I can't help but wonder if other aspects of the game might have been better if this wasn't eating up time and resources in development. Was it worth a shot? Maybe, but Assassin's Creed has always been a single-player experience. I didn't necessarily understand the need to shake that up, as cool as it was, but Unity demonstrates why it was perhaps a step too far. It took up too much time to implement, it became a massive marketing point for the game, and the game can't commit to it because it's also trying to tell a single-player story. If I had to choose between a more airtight single-player experience and a totally co-op game, I know for a fact I would have gone for the single-player experience. The fact the co-op is here, and it's encroaching on the quality of the rest of the game without the game wholeheartedly committing to it, like getting it working was all that mattered, just confuses me, because can you imagine just how many design decisions were based on this being here rather than being the best Assassin's Creed game it possibly could? Can you see why that massive technical obstacle hindered the modernization of Assassin's Creed back in 2014? It's trying to pull in 2 opposing directions, single player and multiplayer, in a way the previous game's PvP multiplayer didn't, because ultimately that was a separate game mode. And I'm not saying this is an area where you can't have your cake and eat it, but let's look at the facts about Ubisoft and Assassin's Creed at the time. This was at the height of this series having annual releases. There was no world in which they'd have been able to nail both these things, and co-op and multiplayer in general doesn't have the shelf life of single player, because now it's impossible to randomly find people playing it. So you've either got friends who are just as insane as me, or this far down the line you're playing it solo anyway. In other words, Unity took the long way round to becoming a single player game, and I can't help but feel it's worse off for it. So, we've established that Unity was a game packed with fantastic ideas, but it arrived deeply flawed. It pulled in too many directions, it compromised on every aspect of itself to accommodate all the other aspects that weren't necessarily the most compatible. So beyond the technical disaster class that it launched as, we know why it didn't do so great. But despite this, you can see a plausible future in a lot of what Unity established. Why wasn't it the future? The answer, unfortunately, is very simple. Ubisoft being Ubisoft. Unity may not have been the best game it could have been or even close, but it was a game with vision. But in wake of Unity's poor reception, the technical issues, and much of the criticisms of what lay beneath, I think it's fair to say there were plenty of Assassin's Creed fans, myself probably included, who clamoured on about a need for a big change in the series. And Ubisoft being Ubisoft, they kind of listened, and as a result, after Syndicate released to not so great sales, and who could blame the consumer, Assassin's Creed reinvented itself as a series of open-world RPGs, and the assassin element slowly faded into the cracks in exchange for historical tourism. I don't necessarily think this was the right move for the series. I think Unity was, despite all its flaws, onto something, at least now with the benefit of hindsight, and while pandering to the fans was almost certainly the answer that made the most business sense to Ubisoft at the time, I think from the ashes of this battered game, Ubisoft could have created an Assassin's Creed game that truly was revolutionary. But that is now a future we will never see. I'm sure of this. Ubisoft have seen extraordinary success with the RPGs. Why would they ever go back to this? This is harder to make. It services a niche, whereas the RPGs service the mainstream. The RPGs are safer. They're painfully average, to be honest, but while that makes them technically better than Unity, which is more on the poor side in my opinion, I'd take Unity over those games any day. Why? Because it dared to be bad in pursuit of being great. It was diluted by its own ideas, it fell victim to its own premise, it was way too ambitious and marketed as such, the expectations were through the roof, and the delivery was through the floorboards, and the RPG era may not have been anywhere near as much of an emotional rollercoaster as that, but at least Unity didn't play it safe and took risks. I don't think this game ever had the legs to be the best entry the series had ever seen, but there was certainly a platform here that could have been built off of, a future that will never be. And all we got instead was Syndicate sheepishly reusing some of its assets rather than a wholehearted follow-up that would take what worked, refine it, and remove the stuff that didn't. So that is the biggest shame with regards to Assassin's Creed Unity. It's a game that wanted to be something for the series and could have pushed it forwards in an earnest way the RPGs never could. And with that, I shall leave you. I thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon. I promise the next video will be on something I like. I need it as much as you.